Welcome back to the Built on Purpose podcast, brought to you by Y Scouts. I'm your host, Max Hansen, the CEO of Y Scouts, where we find purpose-aligned and performance-proven leaders. Speaking of, today our guest is Michael Erath. Michael Erath is a seasoned entrepreneur, best-selling author, and founder of Next Level Growth. He scaled his family business from $8 million to $45 million before rebuilding from scratch after the Great Recession. Today, he helps leaders build elite organizations through high-impact coaching and operating frameworks. Michael's books include Rise and the 5 Obsessions of Elite Organizations that capture his powerful journey and insights. Michael, welcome to the Built on Purpose podcast.
Appreciate it, Max. Great to be here. Thank you.
And just to start out, the 5 Obsessions of Elite Organizations was just put out, so grab yourself a copy. I'll start out. We'll be talking a lot about the principles in that. So I just kind of want to start out, with that. As we get into those principles, though, I do want to start out, like, your story is pretty wild. You went from scaling a business to losing it all and then rebuilding. What was the moment you thought, okay, I'm done, I'm starting again?
Yeah, and that really became the context behind the first book that I put out, Rise. But I was a second generation in a family manufacturing business. We were based in Virginia. We manufactured hardwood veneer for the furniture industry, kitchen cabinet companies, door and panel manufacturers. And when I took the business over in my late 20s, one of our biggest challenges was sourcing raw material and really getting the logs that we needed for production. And so I joined YPO right about the time I turned 30. I was in the Southern 7 chapter, and a couple of guys in my form group had gone through some vertical integration. And so I was intrigued with finding a way to get closer to the raw material source. And I ended up bringing on a partner and creating a subsidiary company that actually bought standing timber, and he would merchandise all of the logs that we didn't want to produce, and we would keep what we wanted to produce. So over the course of the years, we scaled the business together. He and I became best friends. I was his son's godfather. We vacationed with our spouses together and became really close. And in late 2008, when the housing market started to unravel, I not only found out he'd embezzled $500,000 in 18 months, but he was committing bank fraud as the managing director of one of the two entities. So at the time that happened, my father had passed several years before, and we had transacted my mother out of the business. So I was the sole owner, but we had taken out in the manufacturing side a $6 million term note for some CapEx improvements about 18 months before this happened. So we had millions of dollars in new equipment, new facilities, and my mother at the time this happened was hung on the bank guarantee, but now she no longer had equity in the business. My wife and I were also on the guarantee. And so we decided we really needed to figure out how to fight another day, live to fight another day, and also to protect my mother's assets and protect ours as well. So at the time, for people who remember that going through that era, most people in trouble were throwing the keys at the bank and just letting the attorneys sort it out. So that became an opportunity I was able to seize on, and I went to the special assets group. We hired a private investigator. We went to the U.S. Attorney's Office, went to the bank with what we had found, but I negotiated with the special assets group to give me just enough ongoing liquidity to keep the business operational, to go through an effort to unwind it to the benefit of all the creditors versus forcing everything into bankruptcy. So we took the approach that my wife and I would take the haircut, but we would keep our creditworthiness intact. And so the bank, I think at the time, because we were one less fire to fight, they agreed to go along with that. And so for about a year, I spent every other week having meetings with the special assets group, which was a miserable process, but an incredibly educational one at the same time, and had some very fortunate breaks, was able to get the bank made whole, got the creditors made whole. So we got through that, and basically we sold our home, we moved to Ohio and started a new business in the same industry about a year and a half later, where we outsourced all of the production. We essentially took the equity in our house because we kept our credit intact. We were able to get an SBA loan and just kind of rebuilt from the ashes of what we had before. And it was really, I think, I realized through that time that I probably was not going to make a great employee, and I needed to figure out how to restart something myself. And that was the only industry I knew. So I needed to find a way to rebuild in that industry. We moved to EO in Columbus, Ohio, grew that business from a startup to about 7 million before I exited that business as well.
Wow. I mean, what a story. And by the way, the first question at the beginning, it was like how you were saying, I'm not done and I'm starting again. I think I said I'm done and I'm starting again. So
Right.
you answered the question right, but I just want to clarify for anybody listening. They're like, okay, I don't know if that was asked right. So that experience of, pretty much, I wouldn't say losing everything because you kept it intact. And that was like fighting through that probably, built a lot of character resilience. But how did like kind of losing that and having to start over change the way you lead and coach today?
I think it's given me a very deep sense of empathy for the emotional challenges and some of the loneliness that being an entrepreneur entails that most people don't see or understand. And of course, with our peer groups, those of us in YPO, EO, that's part of what we're in those groups for. But I think having lived through that is something that gives me a sense and a style of coaching and working with others that is from having gone through and actually lived through the things that either they're very concerned that they don't want to have to go through, or they're very interested in leaning on the experience that I've actually lived through in order to help themselves.
Mm. Yeah. And we share, when you go in his office, he's got a wall of all his clients. There's so many clients that we have worked with, both worked with over the years. So it's an amazing wall to look at. What surprised you most about yourself during kind of the rebuilding phase?
I think one of the things that going through that did, there's a quote, and I've actually got this in my first book. I think it's a Bill Gates quote, but I could be mistaken, but that success is a lousy teacher because it seduces intelligent people into thinking they can't fail. And I had a lot of those trappings of success, in my mid 30s. And, we were 45 million. We had 200 employees. We had offices on 6 continents. And so I think I was beginning to get somewhat blinded by the success that I was having. And it took some self-reflection and some time to really realize that I needed to let go of that and really just start over again and rebuild myself as well as rebuilding the business.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I see the danger of a lot of successful entrepreneurs is that they have success and the success, to your point, it's a trap that makes them forget that timing and sometimes a little bit of luck plays into it. And so
Right.
they think that, it's all them and sometimes they forget how to go with the flow. So it's certainly what a lesson for you to learn. You became one of the top EOS implementers, but eventually evolved beyond that. What was the moment or insight that made you say, like, there's got to be a better way and continue to look for the model that you arrived at now?
Yeah. So, a little bit of backstory on that. So when I was building the second business in Ohio, that's when I first came across and read Traction with my EO forum. And like a lot of entrepreneurs, I'd read lots of books, and from my time in YPO, I'd been through Mastering the Rockefeller Habits and adopted some of Ern's concepts. I'd been through top grading and really loved top grading, and we'd adopted some of that, but it was all very piecemealed. And when I was first exposed to EOS, I did appreciate the holistic approach of it all. And I also felt like it was simple enough that I could take what I had done in the past and get my arms around it. So when I exited the business in Ohio, North American Veneer, when I exited that, I went to work in 2015 for EOS as an implementer. And because of my story, I was able to connect really well with our prospects or with target market clients. And so I grew really fast. And to your point, I had, I think, the record for the most revenue in the second and third year coming on board. But at that time with EOS, we were under a license agreement. So there was no control over us kind of painting outside the lines and being highly flexible. And I always took an approach, and I think this maybe goes back to the empathy from what I had been through, but I really wanted to meet our clients where they were and do anything I could within or outside of the EOS system to bring them value and what they needed based on what they were going through. So I was using, I'd figured out how to get to profit per X for most businesses, and I was facilitating that. I was doing flywheels for our clients. There were tools from Vern Harnish and Scaling Up I liked better than some of the EOS tools. So I was making substitutions where it fit the client. And whether they liked it or not, that was not something that the leadership at EOS could control. In 2019, 2020, after private equity purchased the company, they transitioned to a franchise model. And when we started looking at the franchise agreement and what would and would not be allowed and how they were able to control that, essentially, if I had continued forward as a franchisee, I would have been bound by the agreement to not teach anything that was not an EOS tool, which I felt like significantly devalued me. And I felt like that also to say that all you need is one system, all you need are these tools, that's all anybody ever needs. I think that's just not entrepreneurial at all to think that way. And so what I started to realize is that the world of these business operating systems offered highly prescriptive systems, and that one size fits all idea just doesn't really fit for long when you're growing. So I wanted to go upstream and really focus on what are the principles behind this? And that's where we came up with this principled approach, which really puts primacy on the user and on outcomes versus the system. The system's always secondary the way I look at it. Whereas what I was finding in the world of EOS and these business operating systems is that primacy is often put on the system, not the user. And I think that's to the detriment long-term of the entrepreneur and their organization.
Got it. Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. And it's so fun. I get to go into Michael's office and we just geek out about all the stuff we're about to talk about. So
Right.
I can't wait to dive into it more. Let's talk about the book. I guess what I want to get into the 5 obsessions of the lead organizations. I think it's not just the systems; it's more of a mindset. And I kind of, when I read through it, I'm like, yes, you can go back through. And you're never really, you're never going to master them necessarily. It's always these things that you're going to be working on, these components of the business. But what made you frame them that way, like as obsessions versus principles or habits?
So, great question. So on our YouTube page, there's a 60-second video clip of Nick Saban giving a talk that really, really resonated with me and led to how we really decided to frame this and voice our brand. And it's about something he calls 5 choices. And so in this short clip, he says that we all have 5 choices in life as to how we want to do things. We can choose to be bad at what we do, which some people do, surprisingly. We can choose to be average at what we do, and we can choose to be good at what we do, which he says is probably all that's expected of us with whatever abilities we have and or were given. But we can also choose to be excellent, or we can choose to be elite. But if we choose to be excellent or elite, we have to have a special discipline and focus and passion and drive to do things to a high standard and a high quality all of the time. And if you don't have that, you probably never get past good. And so it really resonated with me as I'd worked with lots of different organizations. And I literally had some people that when I was working with EOS, their reason for wanting to do EOS was because everybody else in their form was, so they figured they should probably be doing it too. If that's the reason you're doing it, you will never put the effort into it to really do it to a high standard. And so we started looking at if we take the best of our best clients, one of our good friends is Lauren Bailey, and I talk about her in the book. And I think, she's the kind of person that has a drive and a passion to do things to an incredibly high level and high standard. And what she has done is I believe something truly elite. And so when I thought about the clients that I'd worked with and that we had history with who had really gone to a whole nother level in terms of their drive, they literally seemed to be obsessed with the handful of things that they were focused on. And all of those things tied back to some common principles. And so as we started to see that commonality, that's what led to the idea that, I think there are 5 key principles that we refer to as obsessions if you're truly going to be an elite organization.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're going to dive into it because the first one is a doozy and we couldn't agree more. But before we do that, you talk about building both ROI and ROL, return on life. What does ROL mean to you personally, and how do you help others measure it? I think that's a super interesting, and like there's so much there in itself.
Sure. And it's so, I thought about in my own history, my own experience, and obviously from the peer groups that we're in, we see this. But what I was finding was the more time I spent in peer groups and the more time I spent really analyzing my own journey, I believe that most entrepreneurs, whether they're going through it now, they've been through it in the past, or they'll go through it, most of us go through a period where we are achieving success at the expense of our friendships, our relationships, our time with our family, often our physical health, and even our emotional health. And I think at a very human and philosophical level, I think that's not fair, and I don't think it's necessary, given all the risks that we take and all that we do. And so that's what really got me to this idea. We do that in a pursuit of return on investment often. And I believe that we also need to focus on how to use that to gain a return on life and how to balance things in a way that we can use this amazing asset we have in our business to not only generate a return on investment, but also a true return on life.
Man, I absolutely love it. There's so much to talk about there, but I'll try to table that. We'll hopefully get into it as we get into some of these other things. But man, that is so powerful for sure. Let's start into obsession 1. Great people. I couldn't agree with you more. I would actually say, and this is no knock on any of these other business frameworks. But anytime I see a business framework, and we'll use like EOS, or we'll use Rockefeller Habits. So we could just use those as examples, but I'm not picking up that.
Right.
But when I look at those, I think the last EOS conference I went to, it was great. It was last year. I left there and I was like, you know what? They sell everything except how to find great people. Mm-hmm. And there's some focus on that. They wrote the People book recently, and there's some things in there. But from a framework standpoint, none of it matters unless you have the right people. So the first obsession of great people, you start with great people. What's a common mistake you see leaders make when hiring or developing talent?
Oh, gosh. A couple of things. One, I think a lack of a really well-optimized process. I think a lot of organizations and leaders don't put a tremendous amount of time and effort into the process they follow in order to get the kind of people they want. And so there's a great quote. I've seen it attributed to Edwards Deming, research for my book. I think there was a healthcare CEO, Paul Batalden, that it was actually truly accredited to, but that every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. So if you consistently hire and onboard mediocre performers, you have a perfectly designed system to get you mediocre performers. If you want a different result, you've got to do something different with your system. But oftentimes we don't think it through that way. So I think really looking at the recruiting and onboarding, I think setting clear expectations is really important. I'm a big believer that when it comes to people, the underlying cause of most of our frustrations is unclear expectations. So most, and you probably, I've seen this as a joke, but I think there's a significant amount of truth in it, that most job interviews are 2 people sitting across the table lying to each other, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's a fair amount of truth to that. But if I'm interviewing to come to work for you, and you're really clear with me in the interview process about what specifically is expected of me if I'm going to be an A player in your organization, and I get really clear with you on my questions, and we go into that relationship highly aligned, it's much more likely I'm going to be successful. It's also much more likely I'm going to hold myself accountable to the things that we got clear on. And I'm certainly going to be more open to being held accountable if I slip, because when we have clear expectations up front, they, I think, in essence, create de facto agreements that oftentimes we're in such a rush to fill a position because we sense the pain of not having it full that we do it too fast. So I think that's a big piece on the front end, but I also think there's a second step to that. I talk about that in the book, and I ask people a lot, do you feel like if I talk to the last few people you brought on board as new employees to the company, did they have a great onboarding experience or did they get waterboarded? And I think the other reality is most of the time when we hire people, starting from day one, like their first 90 days, they're getting waterboarded. They don't have a great experience. It doesn't set them up for success. And those people tend not to stick as well as, obviously if you have a great onboarding experience, you kind of come out of that loving the company, loving the person you report to, having a great relationship with them. And all those things lead to more stickiness and I think more value, because when people feel appreciated, they perform to a higher level. Right?
Yeah, 100%. Well, let's dive a little bit further into this because there's so much to unpack here. I think what's interesting here, and I'm sure you hear this a lot, is I've never met a leader that's, doing their thing, a successful leader that is in successful at growing businesses. And I ask them if they believe that hiring the right people is the most important thing that they do. They always say yes. And then to your point, the next question is I start to unpack all right, what does your process look like for hiring? And they don't have a scalable, repeatable process. And so then they just don't, they're lost for words as to yeah, you have a good point. It's the most important thing that I do, but I'm not spending the amount of resources and time on it. It blows my mind. That's just how it is. I think it's just one of those hard things. But I think there is one thing, your language I love, but you talk about most critical outcomes for roles. And, we talk about success outcomes, I think we're going down the same road, talk about missions, most critical outcomes and obsessions. How does that change the way you define roles and coach your team? Or how does that define how you coach people to define roles?
So, yeah, I appreciate that. So when I was using EOS and when I was an implementer, I initially felt like, okay, the accountability chart concept, this is way better than an org chart, starts to create more clarity. But as we got into the coaching around it, having, for example, bullet points for, a director of operations that say make the product or deliver the service, or some of those vague statements like that, they going back to my statement that the underlying cause of most of our frustrations is unclear expectations. I don't believe that provides enough clarity. And so as we kind of, went to the lab and started figuring out how do we keep the simplicity of the idea behind an accountability chart so it doesn't turn into a job description, but add some context that gives greater clarity that allows us to more acutely hold people accountable to specific things. This idea of layering in 3 concepts to an accountability chart sheet came to pass. And it was, first, make sure you have a mission for every role on the accountability chart. And the way we define that is it's a 1-sentence, very clear description of the deliverable that is required to be successful in the role. So, you could take a CEO, for example. If I'm on a board and we've engaged you guys to help us find a CEO, I think at a very high level, and these are often very obvious statements, but they create a lot of clarity. A mission for a hired CEO might be something like grow the enterprise value of the organization by guiding and ensuring the execution of the strategic vision, or something to that effect, and the strategic vision and plan, something to that effect, right? It's not an unclear statement when you hear it, and it seems somewhat obvious. But if I'm being interviewed to come into a company as a CEO, and that's defined as the mission, and if I cannot accomplish that, if I cannot grow our enterprise value to a certain expectation by doing those things, I'm not successful, and therefore I may be replaced. That creates a lot of clarity. And so the second component, the most critical outcome, is in essence, it's the data-based evidence of successfully achieving the mission. And the way we also kind of look at that is number one, it should prove that you have achieved your mission. And so in this case of the CEO, it might be estimated enterprise value dollars to goal. It also, however, should answer a second question. And I think this logic applies all the way down to a frontline employee. And we used this in a little bit rougher way several years ago in my manufacturing business. But it should also prove a reasonable return on investment for the fully burdened human capital cost of the person in the seat. And so you and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, that I think most organizations, if we're going to make a capital investment, we think about ROI. We look at different options based on what the ROI is. But most companies, our human capital is our largest ongoing expense, but we rarely look at the people in terms of ROI and through that lens and get clear on it. So if as a board, we establish a year-over-year growth rate, an estimated enterprise value, and the estimate is based on certain factors that we're going to agree to as how the calculus is done for our organization, that CEO now knows the single most critical outcome that I influence and am held accountable to is the growth of enterprise value vis-a-vis this calculation that we have. So as CEO, that guides me to think differently. It guides me to think about what are the strategic decisions we can implement that impact multiple, for example, because that will help me drive enterprise value better than anything else. And so it helps me focus on the right things. And so that's really that. And that logic, I think, can go all the way down to a machine operator, right? If you hire a machine operator, or if you hire, someone for your marketing team as a social media, specialist, there is an outcome that you can measure that proves to you you're getting a reasonable return on investment or acceptable return on investment for that person to be the right person in the seat. And if you get clear on that, that person now knows what winning looks like. They know what they have to achieve to be successful. There's no question about it. And they can direct their efforts, and you can coach them and support them and mentor them to help them achieve that outcome.
Man, this is music to my ears. Hopefully there are people as nerdy as us that just love to talk about this stuff. But this is the heart of exactly what needs to be talked about. And the other thing is when you know the mission of a role, or it's very clear in one statement, that person in the role can always ask themselves, like, in what I'm doing or in making a decision, whatever it is it helping me with the mission of the role? It's kind of it helps you understand and make it and, come up with answers to different problems that you might have. Like, is this something me or not? I mean, I think it's incredible.
Well, I think if you don't mind, there's, I think, one more thing I want to share on those critical outcomes. And then I want to just briefly talk about obsessions, because where we're going to go in like cultural performance and other things, I think it's important context. So just quickly, when you think about most critical outcome, and if you start with your CEO, and then every person who directly reports to the CEO, their mission and their most critical outcome should be, based on their skill sets, the single most critical outcome they can control or influence that helps drive the CEOs or the person to whom they report. You can take that logic and filter it all the way through an organization. And we have a workshop that we do. We've done this, speaking from stage. We've done it as workshops in small groups, but it's on this concept, and it's called Turn Your Business into a Fabulous Economic Engine. And so if you imagine your entire company from the front lines up, everyone has a very clear, defined, most critical outcome that's measured on a regular basis. And it's the outcome that they influence that drives the outcome of the person to whom they report. And that ladders all the way up to the CEO. If everybody's focused on it, God, Max, if even 2/3 of the people in the company are close to hitting it, you can't help but have better financial outcomes in your business if you just implement. Like, to me, if somebody from the book only took away and used that one concept, they're going to get hundreds of thousands of dollars of value, if not more, over time by just doing that one thing.
Yeah. And one other thing I want to dive into, and this would be something question I'd have, or topic I'd want to talk to you if it was just you and I, but this is great that everybody's, listening. Do you think redefining roles at times is important, and going back to the drawing board, maybe it doesn't change the mission of the role, but maybe the most critical outcome, maybe some measurables. Do you think that's important? And did you see that a problem sometimes where it was right when the person started, but maybe not right, a year or two down the line?
Yeah, and I think it all has to do with where the company is in its growth trajectory, and different phases of growth, different points of scale require different things. And so we have a process we teach, which is under the culture of performance, but we call it quarterly calibrations, and we can get into this later. But the concept is, as opposed to a performance review or a coaching conversation, which often feels very one-directional, the idea of these quarterly calibrations, and one of our clients' chief people officers coined the term, and I mention her in the book. The logic behind a calibration is, if you think of a piece of equipment, if you think of a watch, a fine watch, anything like that has to periodically be recalibrated in order to perform at its best. People, I think, are no different. And so if we're having a process, so if I'm a direct report to you, Max, and we have a process where it's every 3 months or every 6 months, we have a calibration between us around culture, core values, our mission, most critical outcome obsessions, how you think I'm doing, how I think I'm doing. That process will begin to highlight when there are things that no longer fit right or no longer really fit our circumstances for whatever reason they may have changed. And if you're my boss now, it allows us to have a conversation around that, so you can go back to the drawing board and make the modifications that you think are appropriate based on where we are. So there's kind of a top-down and a bottom-up approach to make sure that we are all looking at that and thinking about it on some sort of a periodic basis. And if I'm the employee and I have some weigh-in to that process, I'm going to be much more bought in as a result of it being a dialogue between us versus something you're just doing to me.
Oh, man. You're talking my language. I can't tell you the advice or coaching I give more often than not as we're passing the keys of, all right, you made a great hire. You've got the right leader for this role, he or she. And a lot of times people get really excited, but I have to remind them, I'm like, hey, just so you know, if you have the right person at this point, one of the only things that can go wrong, to your point, is the calibration of expectations, which is on a regular basis, asking the person. The first time I always say, like, maybe 2 weeks in, just so you can get a feel of like how it's going. You say and this was beat into me by one of my coaches for many years, but on a scale, so of onboarding 2 weeks in, you say, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not great at all, 10 being outstanding, exactly how you thought it would go, and then some. Where did the first 2 weeks, where do you rate the first 2 weeks? And because that gives you an idea of like where they're thinking versus what you're thinking. I think, to your point, it's super important to calibrate, because if you have the right leader, the first thing is like, you want to make sure that they're seeing their performance the same way you're seeing it. And if you get off track, that's where danger can happen. And then ongoing, to your point, and this is great, I always say, hey, just make sure to ask on a scale of 1 to 10 how they think they're doing in their role. Let them tell you that number and what's in the gap. And then you can always ask, hey, can I give you my input? And then they're calibrating and making sure they're on the same page.
Right.
And I joke around about this. Maybe this isn't PC, but like, if you go look at history on all the people that have gone postal, what happened was this person thought they were doing a great job for a long time, and then somebody comes in and fires them for not doing a good job. And so they're very angry. So maybe I don't know why I go to that example.
Right.
Sorry for everybody listening. I just digressed a bit, but it is true that's typically the thing, is like, as long as the person in the role, if you have the right person in the role, their expectations or how they see what they're doing in the role is the same as you or thereabouts, and then you can kind of talk about it and get back on. I think everything goes pretty smoothly. So
yeah, it's interesting. So we talk about this onboarding process, and I think I also think people overcomplicate onboarding oftentimes, or they feel like it's going to be too complicated, or they're too busy, which is really kind of an interesting dichotomy, to think that you're too busy to do the thing that would keep you from being busy because you're not cleaning up all their mistakes if you do it right. But I think exactly what you described, and we talk about it as our calibration process. So again, if I came to work for Y Scouts and the person to whom I report, I have a 20, 30-minute tops meeting with them to recalibrate on core values and my mission, most critical outcome, and obsessions on a 1 week, 2 week, 4 week, 6 week, 8 week, 12 week basis, right? So that's what, 5 or 6 touch points. In those first 90 days, it's going to be very clear to you whether or not you made the right hire based on how I'm taking feedback, how I'm taking coaching, how I'm embracing and taking ownership of the role and the onboarding. It's also going to be very obvious to me that, number one, I can't hide from accountability here. So if I don't like that, I'm probably going to self-select out. Now I'm not your HR problem because I just left. And I probably didn't come back for a paycheck because I just wanted to get the hell out of there. But, the other thing is, if it goes well and I really like this culture and I like the feedback and the relationship I'm building with my boss, I come out of that 90 days feeling very supported by my boss and also very close to my boss and like I can talk to them about anything I need to. If I have that kind of an experience, I'm performing much better after 90 days than if I'm just left to kind of flounder around and figure it out myself. I don't know if I'm winning or, how I'm really doing.
Yeah, 100%. Well, we're going to move on. If we don't get to all the obsessions, it just means you're going to have to get the book, as I think you should anyway, but we're going to pick through them. I'm glad. I mean, I knew we were going to focus a little bit on great people, and there's a bunch more. I'm actually making myself get off into the next obsession because there's so much. Sure. The way you see it and the way you talk about mission and most critical outcomes, is right down the pipe and so aligned to what we do. So I absolutely love it. Right. And the second one, obsession number 2, is inspiring purpose. So talk about the difference between a mission statement and truly inspiring purpose.
Yeah. So I want to frame just a little bit of context in that. And the way I like to refer to this is, let's go. So if we think about, okay, we've got great people figured out. We're hiring and onboarding great people who are very culturally aligned, and they have the skills and the desire to perform their roles to a high standard on a regular basis. I could come to work for any company and fit the core values and be a good performer, and I'm going to be a very good employee. But if that company can give me something to emotionally attach myself to that is going to be inspiring to me, it's going to be aligning to me and the people I work with, and it's going to give us a purpose beyond just what job I'm there to do, I will always perform higher to a higher standard. I will bring more energy to my work. I'll bring more passion and creativity to my work because I'm connected to that. And so when we talk about an inspiring purpose, a lot of it started, there are a couple of books that really frame a lot of what we get into here. So, one of the early ones was in The Hedgehog Concept from Good to Great by Jim Collins in 2001. Simon Sinek's Start With Why, I think, helps people better understand how to come up with what their why really is. But then Simon went on to write another book called The Infinite Game a few years ago, which he really talks about as an evolution in his thought. And so we actually now teach a concept that's one of the chapters in that book called Just Cause. And so what Simon talks about is your why is your origin story, your origin statement. It's where you came from. Your just cause is your passionate belief in a future state that doesn't currently exist. Right? So it's more of what you believe in. And he talked about in some of the examples, he talks about how in the early days of Apple, how Steve Jobs was able to attract the kind of people that he did to Apple because he had this vision or this belief of a future state where an individual could stand up to Big Brother, where an individual could compete with a corporation. It happened to be through the computer and the devices that they produced. But that was a core fundamental belief. And even if you look at Apple's closed architecture and things like that, it's still reminiscent of that core belief of an individual being able to stand up to Big Brother. And what happened is because that was something he talked about and that was something he was passionate about, it attracted people who believed the same thing. And so by attracting skilled people who also believe the same thing that you believe, if you can clearly articulate it, the first 4 words or letters of culture are cult. I mean, you're creating literally like a cult-like passion around some common belief. I mean, revolutions are won by people who have a common belief that's even greater than their relative strength to the people, whom they revolt against. And so that really got to this idea of an inspiring purpose. So we look at it as it's understanding your just cause, that belief of a future state that doesn't currently exist, but that you're so passionate about, you're willing to commit your entire career to seeing it advance, and then articulating how that drives your daily purpose, which is kind of your why. And then talking about how you leverage, so back to hedgehog concept. So, in Good to Great, if you're not familiar, Jim Collins talks about your hedgehog concept as the overlap of a Venn diagram of three circles, why you exist, what you can, in his words, be the best in the world at, and what drives your economic engine, your profit per X. So we added a fourth circle, which is just cause, but it's just cause, your purpose or why. I prefer, so if you think about the strategic niche component of it, and Jim Collins' statement, at what can you be best in the world? I mean, he was dealing with a lot of Fortune 500 companies, so they potentially could. While Michael Porter, I think, is a little bit harder to understand in the way he writes, but his strategy, philosophy, and logic is so good. I think the way I prefer Michael Porter's definition, which is, at what can you provide consistent, appreciated, and differentiated value in the marketplace? And so if you start to break that down, at what can you be consistent in that differentiates you in the marketplace, but also this idea of appreciated value I got from Nito Cobain in one of the other books that helped me with inspiring purpose. Nito Cobain is the president of High Point University, and he wrote a book called Extraordinary Transformation. And it's a phenomenal book on how to communicate a passion and a vision around what you want to build and the story that he's been through. Highly recommend that book. But that differentiated value must be appreciated by the marketplace, because sometimes, and we hear Joe Polish talk about, we've all got our glop and we all think our glop's better than everybody else's. At the end of the day, the fact that I can provide differentiated value is actually worthless unless the market appreciates that, right? So it's really got to be appreciated, differentiated value. And so when we use those components to weave together what ends up becoming a mission statement, it starts with a belief, which is very powerful. How we use that belief to drive our daily purpose, how we execute our daily purpose through a strategic niche that differentiates us from everyone else, and then how we leverage our economic engine or our profit per X, or what we focus on as that key financial variable to create the fuel, the profit and net cash flow to reinvest more in advancing this belief. And so that almost becomes its own flywheel or its own cycle.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking our language again. There's so much to dive into. I love hearing how you articulate it, because it's clear and concise with, kind of the rest of I've read through the book, so I have a little different perspective. So those of you that have a chance, read through the book. It makes sense as is, but especially when it starts, all the components come together. But kind of highlight, you talked about it, but just for those that are listening, again, explain how, just unpack this a little bit, inspiring purpose shows up in the day-to-day in decision-making behaviors and company rituals.
Okay. So I think from an executive level, when we talk about strategic decisions we're trying to make, does the strategic decision fit within our niche? Does it support our daily purpose and advance our belief or our just cause? Is it aligned with those things? Is it not aligned with those things? In terms of strategic direction, in a more communicative way with employees, whether this is in daily huddles, feedback through daily huddles, or we call our weekly meetings with leadership and management teams weekly tactical meetings. I think words matter, and it's a weekly meeting about tactical execution. So if I give it some weird code name, people don't know what the hell it really means. So I think just use words that are real to what what the intent is. But in those, providing feedback that, what are some examples of something that happened on the team that aligns with our just cause, that aligns with our daily purpose? What's something you did last week to push that forward? Sharing stories, talking about wins, right? A lot of organizations spend all of their meeting time focused on what's wrong, and they don't celebrate wins. If we can get people to begin connecting the dots in an organization between small wins we have and how they advance our just cause and how they fulfill our daily purpose, it starts to give us this sense of almost like a sense of honor in the things that we're doing, because we're now seeing them as part of something bigger than just the job and just the organization. And so I think organizations that do a really great job of leading with an inspiring purpose are very good at articulating those things on a regular basis.
Yeah, and that is a lot more challenging, as I would say. For me, it's challenging because you're repeating yourself a lot, and I'm not justifying anything at all, but I think most leaders, especially if you have a strong purpose, this is true, and I would say we have a strong purpose, but you talk about it so much so early on that you sometimes forget to reiterate it on an ongoing basis. But that is how you reinforce it. And you almost got to get to the point where like your employees are almost mimicking you because they know you're going to say exactly what you're going to say. But, as a ADD entrepreneur myself, like sometimes I find myself not saying it because I just don't want to bore people and I don't want to repeat it too often, but it's something you can't repeat enough, in my opinion.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And a good friend of mine, Greg Cleary, talks about asking people on teams like, hey, who here does the best Max impression, right? And if your employees can mock you in how you do this, like, okay, it's actually working.
Yeah.
Right? Because they're actually doing impressions of you talking about, this passion and this belief. And so I think that's a good thing. And it makes it fun, right? I think it brings an element of fun when we feel like we're winning and we see how there's a bigger impact in what we do than just the nuts and bolts of it.
Yeah. And you pointed out culture having the word cult in it. And I know like that typically has a negative connotation, but when I think about cults, like from a positive sense, I think, a cult, most people will say, hey, what is a cult? It's something like a strong group of people. A lot of times they're viewed negative, but it definitely has an element where people were repelled from it. Like I don't want to be a part of that. Right. But I think like that's important. I think if like you don't have some people that say that about your business, I don't think that you have a compelling purpose or a compelling culture, because it shouldn't be for everybody. If everybody's like, oh yeah, this is great and everybody loves it, then how do you select and get the people that are going to put in the discretionary effort because they feel like they're more closely aligned and they know that it's a special piece that not everybody's aligned to?
Right. And that really, that's why I think exactly along those same lines, sometimes people bristle a little bit when I talk about a culture of performance, which is the fourth of the 5 obsessions. But if I genuinely believe in my just cause and my purpose, and the people around me in the organization do, why the hell would we not want a culture of performance? Because we can't execute on that belief and that vision if we're not all focused on performance.
Yeah. Let's jump to that one. But I would also say, and this was Alex Stavros, so I know was one of your clients. Yeah. He at one point was very clear on this with me, and we had some great conversations when I met him, years ago before he really accelerated his business. But, we used to talk about, obviously he had a very purpose-driven or has a very purpose-driven business at Embark. And, the purpose of, like, everybody agrees the purpose of business is to create customers, because if you don't create customers, you really don't have a purpose. Mm-hmm. And so that, kind of comes back to kind of where we're headed is a culture of performance. And by the way, who wants to actually show up every day and spend 66% of their life not doing something well?
Right.
So that's why, but talk about like building accountability into the DNA of the company. Like what's a tactic or that a founder can use, and begin to like make that shift?
I think it goes back to starting with clear expectations and making sure that expectations are clear for every role, that we have done a good job of defining for everyone in every role what winning looks like for them in the role. And even in the interview process, in essence, using the interview to unsell people on coming to work for you if this doesn't feel like something that they're going to enjoy and fit well with and really want. And so I think it sets a much higher bar for who you bring into the organization. But as I'm sure you see in a lot of the interviews and the work that you guys do, when that's really clear, the candidates who are going to be a great fit, they thirst for that. Like they're hungry to come into an organization that has this, because, and this has been, top grading, I think, came out in the early 2000s, and this whole idea of A players want to work with A players. They do not want to work with B's and C's, right? And another Nick Saban thing I saw, the way he frames it is mediocre people don't like high achievers, and high achievers don't like mediocre people, right? And so if you have a culture where everyone doesn't aspire to and isn't held to the same high standard across the board, you'll never have any true chemistry because of that dynamic.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, going even back to, what we call success outcomes in your language, mission critical outcome, when you're clear on that and it's measurable, and to your point, kind of the ROI of a role, we see that A players, when they see what we call opportunity profiles, but that's our version of a job description. When you're clear on like the 3 success outcomes, very articulated, very clear, and then how they're going to be measured, it attracts A players. Typically a high performer at another company, that's where they're kind of getting a little frustrated, because they're working with mediocre people, and they've lost a measurement on their role. They're performing at a high level, but the company has not created a culture of performance, and they're not measuring their performance. So this person that is actually performing the highest is the one missing out and eventually leaves, because they see somebody else that is articulating, and they see a game that they can win and actually get credit for, and somebody that's keeping score. So, I mean, I can't agree with you more on that. How do you create a culture of performance that doesn't turn toxic or overly metric driven?
So I think, going back to this feedback loop that we talk about and teach as quarterly calibrations, the one thing we haven't gotten into with accountability chart yet is obsession. So just a real quick example, and I'm riffing from the top of my head, so this may not, I may get a few of the words off, but take a director of operations. All right. And so we've got a mission, we've got a most critical outcome. Interestingly, when we have clients transition from EOS to next level growth, and we're building out their accountability charts, one of the things I'll often ask the team is, so what's LMA? I saw that on your accountability chart. And most of the time they can't remember what the hell it stands for, right? So I said earlier, words matter, be clear. I just write it out. So to me, anybody who leads a team at any level, the first obsession, and think about this as something they have to obsess about on a daily basis to be successful, I usually encourage people to write it out as lead, manage, retain, and hold my team accountable. So leading the team is being the coach, being the mentor, being the cheerleader. Managing the team is more of ensuring the tactical execution and helping them through those things. I put retention in there because I think most people go to work for a company, but when they quit their boss. And so if you have pockets within an organization that have high turnover, or they struggle to retain good employees, you almost always have a leadership problem. And then theoretically, I don't disagree that accountability is a byproduct of effective leadership and management. But in reality, what I've seen is when you have leaders who are not willing to have hard conversations and not willing to hold people accountable who aren't holding themselves accountable, those teams will never become elite. So I think you have to obsess about leading, managing, retaining, and holding your team accountable every day. That becomes something in a quarterly calibration now that I can assess somebody on a 1 to 10 scale. How well do I think they're doing it? How well do they think they're doing it? And we can get realigned, and I can coach them where they need it if I'm their boss. For this director of operations, a second one might be own the operational process playbooks, execution, and outcomes. So that's very different than make the product, right? If the expectation is that you own those, and you own the execution and outcomes, and we're having quality issues or inefficiencies because they're not being followed, I own the execution. So I own the training. I own the fact that people are following them. if people are following them and we just have the process wrong, or we have a gap in our process because I own it as the leader, I have to go figure out how to fix that and implement the change. You might have a supervisor reporting to that director of operations, and in their case, that same obsession would translate, but you would change the verb from own to drive, right? So you want your supervisor to drive the operational playbook's execution and outcomes, but you don't want them to own it, because you don't want them making changes to your process. You want them going to the director of operations if they see something that needs to change. And then lastly, if I'm a machine operator or I'm working for the supervisor, it might be to follow the operations playbooks, period. Right? You just want me to obsess about following the damn playbook and not going off, and doing things my own way. So if we have those, and then we have quarterly calibrations where the employee and the person they report to are just recalibrating with each other on how well they're doing, how well the boss thinks they're doing, and getting aligned where they need to, that becomes a very relational way to drive a culture of performance. And then the last piece, we teach something we call the 7 people solutions. So for anybody who falls below the standard that you want in any one of these areas, there's a 7 steps of kind of intensifying or increasingly intense repercussions, if you will, around people solutions. The first few are much more about coaching, development, providing opportunities and support, but it escalates to a point where if you follow that system, you will always be either coaching people up or coaching people out if they're not effectively performing.
Wow. Yeah.
There's a lot more detail to it, but that's kind of high level fast.
No, that actually, wow, maybe a little bit overly simplified. If you just like one of those 2 things, if you're always doing those 2 things, you're going to make progress.
Right.
I think what most people do is they aren't giving real feedback and aren't holding people accountable, which, part of holding people accountable is, coaching them either step up or step out, and get them to some place where they can, in being a humanitarian, get them to a team where they can step up. If it's not on your team, then you got to get somebody in there that can. We've got more time. I don't want to take you too far over, but we've got 2 more obsessions left. I want to maybe touch on those 2. So not to put the pressure on you.
Sure.
And then I've just got like a handful of questions that I just, want to ask you, because I think the audience, now that they have a grasp of who you are, just some questions in general that like almost like a lightning round of questions that I want to ask. But let's talk about, and I'll let you kind of wrap it up, because I know we could get deep in both.
Sure.
But let's talk about bring us home through optimized playbooks and growing profits and cash flow. And again, this is all in the book, 5 Sessions of Elite. What's the
5 Obsessions of Elite
Organizations. Sorry, I was going to say companies. I'm like, wait, that doesn't sound right.
No, we work with nonprofits too, so organizations.
5 Obsessions of Elite Organizations. I froze up on you. So talk about the 2 last obsessions and kind of how it fits into the entire 5, 6 components.
Sure. So very simply put, the way we look at this is if you have an organization filled with great people, they're aligned and driven by an inspiring purpose, and you provide them with optimized playbooks. So high-level process playbooks that were consistently in a state of continuous improvement. And when I say playbooks, I'm not talking like ISO 9000, work instructions, detailed documents. If you take a professional American football team, they have playbooks that are essentially sketches of what everybody's going to do, right? They're very simple. In practice, people are trained on the details of that. The playbooks are just to remind them, if this is the play we're running because this is the situation, this is your assignment, this is what you do. And if the entire team knows the plays each other are running and they all run them in harmony and they run them properly, the teams that execute on their playbooks consistently throughout the game tend to be the teams that win. It's the missed assignments, it's the breakdowns in the processes and how they're executed that cause teams to often lose. And so thinking about that in your business, it's really no different. We need to provide those higher level playbooks that people can be trained on, checklists, things like that. So it's just really systemizing the consistent, predictable things that happen in the business. So when we have these people, we've equipped them with the playbooks, we've got them embedded in a culture of performance, then the fifth and final, growing profits and cash flow, I find a lot of systems, and I hear coaches say this, I hear people say that, oh, if profit's the byproduct of getting everything else right. And with all due respect, I think that's intellectually lazy to say that. I believe if you're going to truly be elite, you have to be intentional and proactive about how you're growing profits, how you're growing your net cash flow, because that's the fuel that goes back into the engine. So what I mean by that is, are you periodically revisiting your pricing strategy? Do you even have a pricing strategy? Could you explain to me why you price the way you price? Do you price to the market? Do you price to value? Is it just a straight markup? Is it just, well, this is kind of what it's always been? How frequently are you looking at your cash conversion cycle and ways to make incremental, consistent improvements in cash conversion cycles? Do you offer discounts, and do you understand when you offer discounts, how much that robs you of gross profit dollars and how unlikely it is that you're going to sell enough at the discounted rate to not cannibalize your gross profit dollars? In the book, I've got a couple of tables that show you at a 30% or 50% gross margin, how much, and I think it's like I think it's a 5% discount in price, you need like 20% more volume of sales at some crazy offset, or you actually have reduced your gross profit dollars, which you're using to cover OpEx. Like, are you thinking about profit and cash flow that way? Or are you just making kind of off the cuff decisions? And so I believe you can treat profit and cash flow as a byproduct and be good, but you can't treat it as a byproduct and ever be elite.
Yeah, I would 100%. I always, when we're talking with companies and they start talking about revenue stuff, as soon as I know their margin, I can then translate, okay, is it worth having to do another $10 million in business to get X, with its decision, or is it not? 10, once you understand that part of the business, it's a lot easier to make some decisions based on that. So I'm going to jump in to like some questions that they'll be fun, I guess, to ask you and kind of just get your first take. You can answer it as quick as you want. You can jump into it a little bit. It's more like kind of a lightning round, fun, philosophical kind of wrap up. But what's besides 5 sessions of elite organizations? Now that I've didn't brain fart on that, what is a book that you always recommend besides your own?
So I start by saying it depends on the situation and what you're looking for. We often recommend early in the process working with a client that they read Who Not How, because it's important that they get that mindset right. But we also, so there are 10 of us at Next Level Growth that are partners and guides, and all of us have been owners or CEOs of YPO qualifying businesses. So at the time I was in YPO, it was 10 million in revenue, 50 or more employees. And we've built a list of an aggregation of books that we've read. So there's actually a recommended reading page in the resources on our website with over 100 books broken down by category that at least one of us has read and recommends, with links to buy them online. So it really does depend. I think Infinite Game is a great book. I recently read Unreasonable Hospitality, and I think especially in any kind of professional service business, we're in the hospitality business to some degree, and so that's another good one. Atomic Habits is great. I mean, there's so many great resources and books out there.
Yeah. No, thanks for sharing those. What's the most underrated leadership trait?
The most underrated, I don't know that I would say underrated as much as maybe the most overlooked is emotional intelligence and just connecting with the people that are in your charge.
Yeah. No, I'm a lot more street smart than I am book smart. So
yeah,
that helps, I think, in a lot of cases. If you put one message on a billboard for every CEO to see, what would it say?
For every CEO to see, I think it would go back to that quote, every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. If you want a better result, get a better system.
I love it. I absolutely love that. Especially when it comes to hiring, like it hits home so much. What's something you used to believe about leadership that you no longer do?
Early on, I thought it's just going to be fun and sexy. I sure as hell don't believe that anymore.
Oh, I love that. And then what's the best piece of advice you've ever received and who gave it to you?
The best piece of advice ever. Okay, so I think the best piece of advice I ever got was Cameron Harold. I was in his office at his home when he was still here in Scottsdale. And at the time I was an EOS implementer and we were talking about my background, my story. And he looked me dead in the eye and he said, dude, you are more than an EOS implementer. Don't stop there. And I have a lot of head trash in what I do because there's so many people I work with that are so much smarter than me. And I think what he helped me realize was I had a experience and a background of things that I had lived through and been through that gave me a gift that I needed to be more bold in sharing. And so I think that's probably it, because it caused me to get out of this hellacious industry that had become very commoditized and was kind of a race to the bottom. It got me out of that to focus on a different path forward.
I love it. When we were talking about return on life, I will also share something that Cameron says often. Obviously, it's not his quote, but, Cameron's the best at just reminding us, and he'll always say, we'll be talking business. He'd be like, yep, everybody's just walking each other home.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean? To like put it in perspective, you're like, all right, he's good at like putting things back in perspective.
Yeah, right. The death rate's holding steady at 100%. So.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm going to ask a couple other questions.
Okay, sure.
I got you. Okay, good. And then we'll start wrapping up. So in your opinion, is there such a thing as growing too fast? And how much do you coach companies around hypergrowth without losing their soul?
I absolutely think you can grow too fast. Vern Harnish talks about in Scaling Up, you can grow broke pretty easily. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. But I also think if you're hyper growing your business and you've got a family and you're so much more married to your business than your family that you lose your family, you're growing too fast, right? Like that's, I think there are markers and indicators that will tell us that. And sometimes, there's a difference between being opportunistic and being an opportunist. And I think sometimes we're just constantly in this opportunist mode, trying to grow and have more and get more to the expense or to the detriment of other things. And I think if you're really clear on your overall purpose in life and what matters to you and what's important, then grow as fast as you can without disrupting that. But if you're, for more than a brief period of time, if you're really disrupting the things that when you're old and dying, you're going to regret, then you're growing too fast.
Man, what incredible advice. I want one last thing. I was going to give you the last note as well, or the last kind of thing that you want to talk about, but you're building systems that help leaders reclaim their time. Exactly kind of what you're saying, right? Time, freedom, and energy. What's one small change? Because there's a lot here that a founder could take this week and start moving in that direction.
I would say you could start with your direct reports, a calibration process, even if you don't have core values, even if you don't have good performance standards yet to use for that assessment. I saw Alan Mullally talk at Patrick Lencioni's Unconference in 2020, and he shared a matrix that I often share early on before our clients have figured out core values and all these other things. Just evaluate people and have them self-evaluate on a matrix where on one axis On a 1 to 10 scale, you're simply rating how well do they consistently work with others, and how well do they believe that they work with others. And so that starts to give you some cultural fit, because people who generally work well with others in an organization are typically well aligned culturally with the organization. And then on the performance side, just asking the question, how consistently do they do great work? So again, the higher they are on that scale, or how consistently do they believe they do great work? Just those two things will allow you to have a starting place or starting point to a conversation. And then you were at the Genius Network meeting last week, and I think you were there when, I don't remember who it was that said it, but I think the other important piece of advice is be willing to move quickly. And one of our Genius Network members shared a story, I think from a documentary, about the difference between professional poker players and amateurs.
Oh, yeah.
And the biggest difference is that professional poker players play fewer hands. They fold fast if it's not a good hand, and they only play the hands they feel highly confident in. And I think that logic transcribes to people. There was another great quote from Jordan Peterson, that enabling failure is not a noble cause. And I think we so often, we know in our hearts that somebody's not in the right role, or they're not the right person for the job. They feel the frustration of underperformance. We feel the frustration of underperformance, but we just keep going and we keep going. And at the end of the day, they're not happy. We're not happy. Why the hell are we doing this? Have a conversation, be willing to make moves faster with people when your instincts tell you that it's just not right, because our instincts tend to guide us well. And invest the time and energy in finding and surrounding yourself with great people. Everything else you can build on from there.
Man, that's almost a drop the mic ending right there. You can listen to the Built on Purpose podcast, brought to you by Y Scouts. You can listen to all of our past and future podcasts at yscouts.com. Michael, you're absolutely amazing. Please go get his book, 5 Obsessions of Elite Organizations. Just came out about a month ago. Go get your copy, and thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Max. Appreciate it.
All right, thanks.